Hi, welcome to Mississippi Library Commission's webinar on how to host a swap at your library. I'm Sharon Davis, the Library Development Director here. We are always looking for new ways to engage our patrons and to bring new ones in. And swaps are a good, low-cost, low-key way to do that. They also provide our communities with a way to shift away from a more disposable throwaway culture to more sustainable practices. Today, we're going to cover the basics of hosting a swap, including justifying them, different styles or methods of running them, ideas, that's the fun part, for different things to swap. And we're also going to talk about planning them, setting them up, and what to do once they're over. So why even host a swap? We always want to be able to justify the programs that we do, whether it's to ourselves or to our coworkers who are putting in all the time and hard work and effort to make it happen, to our administrators when we're asking for permission to do it. And also, we want to be able to justify it to anyone who we're asking for time, money, or other resources to help make that program happen. So swaps are pretty easy to justify. They promote community involvement and interaction. When people are out there making connections in their community, there are so many benefits, both to the individual and to society as a whole. We can also use these to promote library materials and resources. So, for example, if you're doing a swap of clothing, you can have a display up of your sewing or your mending or your quilting books. If you're doing a plant swap, you can have your gardening or plant care books on display. And if you're doing a swap of items that you really don't have anything in your collection about, well, maybe that's a hole in your collection that you might want to think about filling. One of the best things about swaps is how they increase our visibility in the community. Swaps can draw in people that might otherwise not ever walk in our doors. Once we get them in the door, it's pretty easy to show them all the great things that we have to offer. So even if they don't get a card, don't check anything out, they're seeing that we are doing good things for the community. And that can come in handy when we're asking for community support later on, when it comes to funding especially. And swaps do help support sustainable practices. I think we're all pretty aware of um, the giant piles of plastic and trash that are floating in our oceans, and all of the ecological problems that come from being a more disposable society where we use things once and get rid of them. And swaps are a way to help the community reuse items or find new homes for them. Now, before we get to the fun part, which is all the great things you can swap, we're going to talk about the types of swap. Now, there are two main types. There's facilitated and unfacilitated. Unfacilitated, the library provides the space and the marketing, and the patrons make the trades themselves. The librarians aren't involved in the trading process. This is usually typical of a plant swap or one that's sponsored by another group, like a garden club or a homeschool group. Each patron brings their own items the day of the swap. The library provides the space, perhaps the setup, the table, and the chairs, and then pretty much stays out of that process. There are a few potential problems with this kind of swap to be aware of. There's the potential for miscommunication or unhappiness among participants when they're negotiating their own exchanges. And there are a lot of people who are simply not comfortable speaking with strangers or meeting new people. So this style might be off-putting for some. The other main type of swap, and this is one that we're going to cover in more detail today, is facilitated. The library provides the space, the setup, the marketing, and the patrons make their selections without any interaction with the donors of the items. There is no face-to-face bartering that happens. There is no communication at all that's happening. So this can cut down on the time that patrons need to spend preparing for a swap. If it's a facilitated, they're going to need to spend a lot more time gathering their items, deciding how to present them, doing all of the transport and the setup and the takedown and things like that. It also cuts down on possible unhappy or negative interactions between patrons. So with the facilitated swap, the items are donated before the event, and the staff sort, arrange, and store them. Now, the word swap here can be confusing for some because it sounds more like a giveaway. And in truth, it really is a bit of a giveaway. But that truly depends on how you run it. With facilitated, there are three main ways that you can run these programs. One is an item for item swap. For every item that a patron brings in, they're allowed to take one item at the swap. So they would bring a batch of items in beforehand. The staff sorts through them, arranges them, groups things together like items to like items. And the donor gets a ticket, such as a carnival ticket or a printed and signed slip that says how many items they're allowed to take the day of the swap. Another way of running them is an early bird system, to where you accept donations before the swap happens. You do the sorting and the grouping and the setup, and people who donate items are allowed in the earlier hours or the first few hours of the swap. So if they donate items, they get first pick of what's been donated. And then people who did not have items to donate, but are still interested to see what you've got, they get to come in later. So they don't get first pick, but they still are able to take items with them. And then, of course, there's just an unrestricted swap where people bring items in beforehand and you simply have them up for people to take for free. Now, the type of swap that you decide to do really depends a lot on what you want to swap. And this is the fun part, at least for me, which is trying to find great ideas and things that you think your community is going to love. There are some that are fairly traditional that you see a lot of in libraries across the country. I want you to try and think a little more broadly, sort of like you do when you're trying to search for information. So either broadly or narrowly. So if you want to host a book swap, start thinking about, do you want to do a specific genre? Do you want to do a specific format, publication date, age group? It doesn't necessarily have to be just books. But on the other hand, if you do too narrow of a topic, such as only books by 17th century French authors, you may not get hardly anyone show up. So books and plants are some of the most popular swaps, both for facilitated and unfacilitated. With plants, think it doesn't have to be just a live plant. It could be seeds or gardening tools or even gardening decorations. You know, a lot of times people get things gifted to them, or they've had these decorations in their yards for a really long time. They're kind of getting tired of looking at the same old frog holding an umbrella. And maybe they want to switch it up a bit and go for a gnome instead. So you don't have to limit yourself to something very broad. unless you really want to. Clothing is another popular item for swaps. Again, you can narrow it down to infants or adults or just sweaters. You could even do formal wear, you could do accessories, or you can keep it broad. Household items are another great thing. I know I've got a couple of drawers in my house and a shelf in my closet that's full of things that I just don't use anymore. Whether it's the wok that I got as a wedding present, or that spatula that looked really great, and then the minute I used it, I realized it was not good for my hands. I couldn't hold on to it; it was too big. So a lot of us have these things around already. And the same thing with linens or even decor. People like to change up the art they've got on their walls, or as a friend of mine calls them, the city outies, the pretties, the tchotchkes, the little things that the little statues and the little decorative items that we like to keep out. Well, people like to change those every now and then, and we could end up with a lot of those sitting around our house. Also, seasonal items are great. You do want to plan to make sure that you can do this in time or close to the season that you're wanting to do. This can be decorations, ornaments, unused greeting cards. You know, sometimes you don't want to send the same greeting card for 3 years in a row, but you don't want to throw it out either. Even wrapping paper and gift bags. Sometimes you'll get a package of wrapping paper and you only wanted that one pattern that was perfect for someone. And so it ends up sitting in your closet for a really long time or getting thrown out. Craft supplies are a super popular swap. This could be painting stuff, sewing, scrapbooking, wreath making, journaling, any kind of craft supplies tend to have a pretty good response. Some other ones that are done fairly often are puzzles or board games. It's a little bit more limited, but there are a lot of people who are so devoted to these activities. And once you've played, a version of Trivial Pursuit a few times, you kind of start memorizing some of the answers, and it's not quite as fun anymore. And of course, once you've done a puzzle once, you really don't want to do that one again. So those are very popular items that people love to see in swaps. Now, those are sort of some of the more traditional ones, but try thinking outside of the box a little bit, especially when it comes to younger adults or teens, because we don't want our swaps only to be geared towards adults or older patrons. Think about doing things like enamel pins. A lot of times those are sold in sets, and you only wanted the one of the little kitty cat, but you got the kitty cat, the alien, and the cow all in the set. Buttons and patches, stickers. Sticker sets are so much fun, and you can rarely just buy one sticker. You tend to buy a whole set, and you have a whole bunch left over. Um, a little more complicated would be doing a swap for costumes or for formal wear, but it might be something that your community might respond well to, especially the teens. And don't forget the little ones. Just because they're children does not mean that they can't participate in a swap. But rather than focusing on items like toys or possessions, because when you're younger, sharing isn't always the easiest thing. Giving up your possessions is not always an easy thing. So think about things they can create for a swap. Things like artwork or painted rocks, handmade bookmarks. They could even make handmade books or write stories and swap them with each other. These are not likely to be really big events like a swap for adults or older teens would be. But I think that it would go a long way to reaching some of the children in the community, teaching them about sharing and about collaboration, and maybe even introduce them to a few new friends. Now, there are some things that you probably want to avoid. One of them, a big one, would be food, actual food items. Now, if you're doing something that's prepackaged items, such as, canned goods or boxed or packaged goods, that might be okay as long as you're checking the dates on things. But if you've ever seen a movie or a TV show, and it's pretty familiar trope in a lot of them, where the entire wedding party gets food poisoning. That's I've seen that in a couple of places. And it's just this entire horror show of people being sick and ruining an event. Well, that's what I think of when I think about food and a swap is if you are having people cook and swap dishes, you don't know the cleanliness of the environment or the way that those items were stored before they were prepared or after they were prepared. So you really don't want a scene of a lot of people getting sick at once and being on the night news about that. Uh, Another good thing to avoid would be collectibles. People often are trying to make sure they're getting a good value for what they're trading, or if they are into collecting an item, they're pretty serious about their possessions and what they're collecting and what kinds of things they want. And there could be the opportunity for people to take advantage of less experienced collectors, or for later on someone to go home and say, I can't believe I traded this and mine was only worth $2 and theirs was worth 12, or vice versa. So collectibles probably you should stay away from. You're not looking to trade things of high value or that people have a high emotional investment in. Now, toys seem like you would really want to do, especially for children, because they get tired of their things pretty quickly, some of them. But there would be a lot of time involved and some potential liability. You would have to check to make sure that everything donated was cleaned, sanitized, not broken, didn't have any missing parts or sharp edges where something had broken off that could cause an injury. And you'd also have to research and see if there are any recalls or there have been any recalls on those items. And that can be a lengthy process. So between the cleaning, the sanitizing, the checking, you're putting way more time into it than you probably want to. And again, you don't want to miss something and have a child potentially be harmed by a toy that is broken or shouldn't have been on the market at all. And last thing I'm going to talk about, I try not to be too negative, but health and beauty items. Um, you just don't want to be responsible for passing around any kind of germs or yuckies. Again, you don't want the potential of someone getting sick or being anything unhealthy coming from the kinds of swaps that you're doing. If you're looking for more ideas or for things that are more relevant to your community, there are a few places you can look. Take and see if there are any community groups or organizations in your community, things such as gardening groups or pickleball groups, because that's going to be a built-in audience for a swap that's geared towards them. Also, take a look at some popular local activities. If you know that golfing is really big in your area, then maybe a golf swap would go over well. And another great place to look is other libraries. I'm a big fan of not reinventing the wheel. If you look at some of the larger libraries in more urban areas, ones that put on a lot of programs, that have a lot of money and time and staff to put into their programming. If you take a look at their websites, their calendars of events, see what kinds of things that they are doing. You can also check with local libraries that are nearby to you and see if they've had programs that went over really well in neighboring communities. Now is the not so fun topic, which is planning for these swaps. Most of this is going to relate to facilitated. If it's more for unfacilitated, I'll state that specifically. You need a deadline for accepting items. With the facilitated swap, people are bringing those items to you beforehand. You need time to sort through them, group like items together, decide if there are items that really shouldn't be included. And that's going to take a good bit of time depending on the types of items that are brought in. You also want to plan at least 2 to 5 hours for this event, if not a full day. You want people to have plenty of time to come in, browse around, look at what's there. And everyone's schedule is so hectic nowadays. So you do want to give a wide time frame for people to be able to come and look through the items. Definitely check your calendars for local events. You do not want to be having a swap on the same day that the state fair has come in because you're not as likely to get as many people coming to it. Or, for example, on the coast, they have Cruise in the Coast. Well, everyone knows that you can barely drive around. The traffic is horrible and everyone is focused on the car events. They're not going to be taking time out of a special event to come to something as simple as a swap at their library. You also want to try to choose days and times for your target audience. So if your swap is geared towards teenagers, you definitely don't want to do it first thing on a Saturday morning. Teens like to sleep late. If it's geared towards homeschoolers, you might want to speak with them and see what are the times that they are not already meeting in a homeschool group, or what are the times they feel are going to work best for them. And of course, simple things like you don't want to do something in the middle of the day if it's for school-age children. With unfacilitated swaps, you want to make sure that you include a setup and a takedown time for the participants. A facilitated swap, your staff does that beforehand and then afterwards takes care of it as well. With an unfacilitated swap, you want to make sure that you set a time just for setup before the swap begins and just for takedown. You don't want people, if you set the time for your swap lists as 10 to 12 and people show up at 10 and start setting their things up and bringing things in from their car, well, by 12 o'clock, by the time it gets them to get everything set up, by 12 o'clock, if you're expecting them to have taken everything down and gotten all of their things put back away that weren't swapped, you've missed out on a lot of swap time. They've spent so much time doing the setup and the takedown that there's not as much time for those interactions to be happening. You definitely need to decide on who is going to be handling different parts of your swap. With facilitated swaps, since they're bringing the items in, you need to have someone who is designated to receive it. You need a place for storing it because you're going to have to hold on to these items until the day of the swap. And you also need someone who is going to be able to spend plenty of time sorting the items. Not every item is going to be usable, and not every item needs to be a one-for-one. So for example, if someone brings in a whole box full of watercolor paint tubes, well, you don't want to give them, you don't want people to be swapping one watercolor paint tube for one other craft item or one marker for one sheet of scrapbook paper. So with some swaps, you are going to have to group and sort things together. And again, you're going to have to check for the quality of the items and decide if it's something that you actually want to include. For that, you need a decision maker, someone on your staff who has no problem saying yes or no. Yep, this is a good thing. Nope, we need to find another place for this to live. This isn't good for us, because that's something that's hard to do. And some people just don't have that ability. Some people hold on to everything, and some people get rid of everything. Well, you want someone who can make an actual good judgment decision about these. There is a good bit of staff time that is needed for a facilitated swap. Not so much for an unfacilitated, where the patrons are swapping things themselves, but for a facilitated swap, they're going to need time, your staff are going to need time to sort the items, do the setup of the space, and do the takedown of the space. And also to rehome any items that are left over. Now with an unfacilitated swap, one detail you don't want to forget is a sign-up sheet for participants. Most of us have limited space available, and we want to know beforehand how many tables we want to set up, how many chairs, how many people are going to be there offering items. And if you do just a very simple sign-up sheet, you at least, and set a deadline for signing up, you at least have a small idea of what to plan for in that regard. Sorting and grouping for a facilitated swap. This is going to take a little bit of time. You're going to need a space to store all of the items beforehand. You're also going to need a space to sort them. So you're going to need an empty countertop or some empty tables. And you do need to dedicate some staff time to this. You don't want to end up the day before the swap with plastic bags and plastic totes and piles of things for the swap that you have to go through very quickly and try and make them look presentable, or try and sort through and make quick decisions on whether or not something is useful for the swap. When you are sorting and grouping some of your items, depending on the type of swap you're having, some of the things that might be good to have on hand are things like plastic baggies, like Ziploc bags, twine or ribbon. Think about if you're having a craft swap and you get a lot of yarn donated. You may want to put lots of small bits of yarn, lots of the small yarn balls or leftover pieces into a large Ziploc baggie. Some of the larger batches of yarn you may want to tie together with some twine or some ribbon, so that if you have maybe 5 skins of the same yarn, you're swapping it as a group. Someone is getting the whole of it rather than throwing all of that in a bin and having them sort through and hope that they can find matching pieces. Paper sacks, you're going to want these not just for sorting items, but also for letting people put the things that they're taking into. Of course, some people will bring their own bags and plastic bags, of course. We get lots of those donated if we ask our patrons. But if we're trying to do something that's more sustainable, paper bags are not a bad idea to have as well. Not just for the sorting and the grouping, but for displaying the items. You're going to want either boxes or plastic bins or even paper grocery bags, something like that, so you can have them in something, not just kind of items thrown out on a table. You also might want to think about some rubber bands or paper clips for smaller items or for paper items. So for example, if you're doing scrapbooking or journaling or stickers, you might want something to kind of group some of these smaller items together. And rubber bands, of course, are great, especially for the craft items like paintbrushes or crochet hooks, knitting needles, things like that. Now with your setup and display, you don't really want to just throw things out on a table. You're just not going to get as many items taken home that way. And there are a few things that you need to keep in mind. One is you need adequate space for assistive devices. You need adequate space for someone who has a cane or a wheelchair or needs space to move around. Just because you have a small space and a large number of items donated, don't ignore that. You want everyone to be able to take advantage of your event. Your items should be within easy reach. You really don't want someone unable to reach something at the very back of a table or have something pushed back so far or up so high or so low that they can't get to it. I am 5'1.25", and the number of times that I have risked life and limb climbing shelves in a grocery store is probably bad. But a lot of times people, if they can't reach something, they might try to do it anyways, and you don't want anyone to get hurt. You also are going to need at least one, depending on the size of your swap. You're going to need one staff member who's dedicated to being there the entire time. And you're going to want them to be there to greet people, tell them how it works, how your swap is running, and also to kind of keep things in order, because as people start looking through the items, they're going to leave them a little messy and mush things around. They're going to decide, oh, I don't want this, and stick it in a weird spot that doesn't really make sense or that isn't very organized. So you're going to want someone who is going to spend the time doing that. Now, again, these are for facilitated swaps. For an unfacilitated swap, I would recommend at least one designated staff member for explaining the program and answering any questions. And also just someone to be there to make sure that everything's running smoothly. You also want your display to be organized either logically or aesthetically. If you go to thrift stores, for example, some of them will have their clothing organized by size or by type or both. And some of them will even have it organized by color. So all of the purple, whether it's pants or shirts or skirts, all the purple is together. Or all of the size small is in one spot and all of the size medium in another, that sort of thing. So whether you decide to make your organization logical or make it more aesthetic, having an attractive, organized looking space, you're more likely for these items to find their new homes. So marketing, we're going to touch on this briefly. Now, MLC does have a public relations coordinator. Her name is Christina Kelly, and she is always available to help answer any questions you might have about marketing and also to help create flyers and social media posts. Her contact information is at the end of these slides. With flyers and social media posts, you want to keep them very simple, use very clear language, very simple writing style. If your community has not had swaps before, there are going to be a lot of questions like, what is this? How does it work? Why should I even do this? And so you want to keep it as simple as possible. In addition to advertising your standard means, your social media and flyers and your locations, there are some other places you can go to. Look for local related social media groups to the swap that you're doing. So if you're doing a plant swap, see if there are some groups that are gardening groups in the area. And send them a quick email or a quick message through the platform and say, hey, we're having this event. Would you post it for us? Also related clubs or organizations. So if you're doing an art supply swap and you have a local art museum, maybe they would post your event as well. You can also look at local homeowners association or neighborhood groups or apartment complexes. Sometimes these are a great way to get the word out. It may not be citywide or countywide, but if you can locate these and send the information to them, they might be able to get word to more people than you can just using your own social media. And also, there are quite a few buy nothing or upcycle or exchange groups in a lot of communities. And especially when it comes towards the end of your swap, when you have leftover items, these groups, part of their existence, part of the reason for their existence is to exchange and trade and barter goods, or to put out there the kinds of items that they are looking for. So take a look and see if any of those exist. And again, buy nothing is a term that's used for some of these groups, and so is upcycle. So if you search for groups that way, you might come across some that you didn't know existed. Well, once the swap is over, there's a good chance you're going to have items left over. Before the swap happens, you need to have a plan of what to do with these items. Are you going to hold on to them for another swap? If your swap was really successful and you're going to think maybe you'll do it again in 3 months, 6 months, next year, and you have the storage space, then fabulous. But what if you're not so sure you're going to do it again, or it wasn't as great as you'd hoped, and there's just, or maybe you don't have the storage space to keep all of these things. You need to make a plan beforehand so when the swap's not over, you're not standing there staring at a whole bunch of stuff going, oh boy, what do I do now? And you also need to have a plan beforehand so you can answer those donor questions like, here, all the Sharon, I'm bringing it, I'm dumping it off. What are you going to do with it if it's left over? You want you and your staff to be able to answer those questions before the event happens when the donors are bringing things in. So one thing to do is identify and contact charitable organizations. You want to not just know that they exist, but make sure they're able to accept the items that you have left over. You may know from people who bring in donations of books to the library that Sometimes we accept things, even if we really don't need them or really can't use them because we don't want to say no to someone who donates to us. And other organizations go through that as well. So don't just identify the charitable organizations in your community, contact them. Let them know what you're doing. Ask them if these kinds of items will be useful to them. Also, take a look at these Buy Nothing or similar local groups, the trading groups or exchange groups, because you can always offer these up on these, in these groups, on their online social platforms, um, for them to come and pick up. And always make sure that you are able to inform your donors beforehand what's going to happen to those items. You don't want someone to bring you something for a swap and come back, a week later or 2 days after the swap or a month later, even say, well, so what happened to it? Did somebody take it? Who took it? Or where'd it go? You want them to know beforehand, assure them that their items are going to be rehomed if no one takes them from the event. Which brings us to unusable items. Sometimes people will bring us things that are just unusable. There is nothing we can do with them. We can't find a home for them, or they are simply not fit for being reused. So that doesn't mean you have to put them in the trash necessarily. You can look at recycling them. You can think about breaking them down into different components for using in crafting or upcycling programs. A good way to find ideas for this is to simply take the item that you've got left over and Google or whichever search engine you use the item and the word upcycling and see what kind of ideas are out there because there are so many people who really work to reuse every last little thing, and they have some amazing ideas out there. So one example would be if you had some clothing donated that was stained or had a lot of holes in it or super frayed. There are so many groups that are dedicated to what kind of things you can do with scraps of fabric, whether it's making rugs or small stuffed animals. There's so many great ideas out there. So do a search for that first before you decide to actually just totally throw something away. But sometimes you are going to get items that can't be reused, they can't be recycled. When it comes to that, don't beat yourself up. It is okay to throw things away. If you're getting donated, you know, a good example might be those watercolor tubes again. If you've got someone who took up watercolor painting, decided they didn't like it, brings them to a craft swap, you open that tube up and everything is dried up, and your recycling will not take that kind of packaging. Sometimes there's just nothing else you can do with these items. So don't beat yourself up over that if it comes to it. And you definitely want to document what you've done with your program. At the very least, you need to document the attendance. If you want to get a little more detailed, you can do an approximation of the number of items donated. You don't want to count every single marker or crayon that gets donated for a craft swap. But you do want to at least have a decent idea of how many things actually changed hands. And you need to write down while it's still fresh in your mind. What went right? What went wrong? Because if you or any of your other staff or any of your colleagues decide to try something similar in 6 months, a year, 3 years down the road, if you have a list of things that worked and things that really didn't work or that you would have done differently, then they're not starting from scratch, or you are not starting from scratch trying to remember what you did the last time that you had one of these events. And that can save you and your colleagues a lot of time in the long run. And of course, check with your administration and see what kind of numbers or what kind of documentation they require for the programming. So if you have any questions, please always feel free to contact us. My contact information is on here. You can call me, you can email me, whichever works best for you. And also on there is Christina Kelly, our public relations coordinator, who is a marketing guru and can help you figure out maybe if the best ways and also maybe some inventive ways to get your programs out there to try and bring in more patrons. Thank you so much, and do let us know if you really liked this webinar, or if there are any topics that you would like to see us cover in the future. Bye-bye.